Silas Granger grabbed his youngest daughter, Clara, by the wrist and pulled her behind him like she was a prize horse at auction. Not a person, not his child, just something to be displayed. He planted himself in the center of Red Hollow's main square, raised one thick arm toward the tree line, and shouted loud enough for every man, woman, and child within 3 blocks to stop what they were doing and stare. "Any man brave enough to kill that devil bear gets his pick of my daughters," he bellowed. "Anyone he wants, no dowry required. Just bring me proof." Clara giggled nervously. Eliza, the middle daughter, smoothed her hair. Neither of them noticed that somewhere behind the dry goods store, pressed against the wall with flour dust on her apron and a notebook clutched against her chest, Rosalie Granger had heard every word and understood exactly what her father had just done. He hadn't offered his daughters. He had offered them, the beautiful ones, because the other one didn't count. If this kind of story, where the ones who were never counted finally make everyone stop and take notice, if that moves something in you, hit that like button right now and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because I promise you, what Rosalie Granger does with the life her father tried to throw away will stay with you long after the final scene. Now let's go back to the beginning. Wakid. The bear had been coming for 3 seasons. Not a regular bear. Every old-timer in Red Hollow said so, and for once the old-timers were right. Regular bears raided at night, scattered when you fired a shot in the air, moved on when the easy food ran out. This one was different. It came in the afternoon sometimes, bold as anything, tearing through the Granger orchard with a kind of focused destruction that felt almost intentional. It had killed 2 ranch hands from neighboring properties the previous autumn. It had broken the arm of a man named Colton Fry, who tried to drive it off with a fence post. It had dragged a calf out of the Hendersons' barn and left it halfway up the ridge as though it wanted everyone to know exactly where it had been. People in Red Hollow had taken to calling it the Grey King, though nobody knew exactly why. The name just stuck. Something about the way it moved, unhurried, heavy, certain of itself, made the word king fit in a way that felt uncomfortable to say out loud. Silas Granger had lost 11% of his apple crop to it the previous summer. This summer it had started earlier and hit harder, and Silas was not a man who absorbed losses quietly. He was a man who transferred them onto his workers, onto his neighbors, onto anyone smaller than himself, which was most people. And in the particular economy of the Granger household, no one absorbed Silas's losses more reliably than Rosalie. She was his eldest, 31 years old, though she moved through the world in a way that made some people guess older because of the steadiness in her eyes and the way she never rushed. She was heavy, had been since childhood, carried it in the way some people carry an accent, as something that just was, that had always been and probably always would be. Her sisters were lean and quick and pretty in the way that made men turn their heads on the main street of town, and Silas had spent years making sure Rosalie understood the difference between herself and them. Not in cruel speeches, he wasn't theatrical about it, just in the 1,000 small ways a parent can arrange the world so that one child always understands their place. The good chair at the dinner table that wasn't hers, the new fabric that wasn't purchased for her, the visitors who were introduced to Clara and Eliza and then glanced past Rosalie as though she were part of the furniture. She had stopped expecting anything different somewhere around her 17th year. By 31, she had built a life inside the space she was given, which was mostly the orchard. The orchard had been her mother's. Margaret Granger had planted the first 40 trees herself, had expanded it over 15 years into something that produced enough fruit to keep the household afloat, and then some. When Margaret died, a hard winter, a chest infection that came on fast and finished faster, Rosalie had been 19 and had simply taken the orchard over because someone had to and no one else was going to. Clara was 13 and spent her days practicing hair arrangements. Eliza was 16 and largely decorative. Silas knew how to sell the apples and how to yell about the ones that weren't right, but couldn't have named the difference between a root aphid infestation and water stress if his livelihood depended on it, which it did, which was why Rosalie ran the orchard. She had a system, notebooks, 4 of them by now, filled front to back with observations, dates, rainfall measurements. She took herself with a tin can and a ruler, sketches of pest damage, records of which trees had produced well and which ones needed to be pulled before they infected their neighbors. She had taught herself to read the signs a season was going to give her from the way the blossoms came in, from the color of the soil after a dry week, from the particular quality of silence in the orchard at certain times of day. She had also, over the past 8 months, been tracking the bear, not hunting it. She was clear-eyed enough about her own abilities to know that hunting the Gray King was not something she could do alone and survive, but tracking it, watching where it came from, mapping its routes through the ridge above the orchard, recording which nights it came and which ones it didn't, and what the weather had been on each, that she could do, that she had been doing quietly in the back pages of her 4th notebook, while the men of Red Hollow argued in the saloon about the best way to catch it and did nothing. She had tried to tell her father what she'd learned, once in November, once in February, once in April. The November conversation lasted about 40 seconds before Silas cut her off to ask Eliza something about a letter she'd received from a man in the county seat. The February one went slightly longer, long enough for Silas to say, "Rosalie, what in the hell do you know about bears?" before he walked out of the kitchen. The April conversation didn't happen at all because she watched her father's face as she started to speak and recognized the particular set of his jaw that meant he had already decided not to hear her. She had stopped trying after that, just kept tracking, kept writing it down. The morning Silas made his announcement in the square, Rosalie had been up since 4:30. She'd walked the orchard perimeter at first light the way she did every morning, checked on the grafted trees along the east fence that were still establishing, noted fresh damage to the northern section where the Gray King had come through 2 nights before. She had the damage in her notebook. She had the tracks in her notebook. She had a theory about where it denned that she had been refining for 6 weeks. Then she'd gone to town for flour and come back to find half of Red Hollow buzzing about Silas Granger's offer. She heard it from Mrs. Potts at the dry goods counter before she heard it from her father. Mrs. Potts told it with the particular relish of someone delivering news they know will wound. "Your daddy's offering up one of you girls," Mrs. Potts said, measuring out the flour with careful scoops. "Whichever cowboy kills that bear gets his pick. Isn't that something?" Rosalie set her coin on the counter. "Which daughters?" Mrs. Potts looked at her with an expression that managed to be both pitying and satisfied at the same time. "He said any one of them." Rosalie picked up her flour sack. "All right. Must be exciting," Mrs. Potts offered. "Could be your chance." "Thank you for the flour, Mrs. Potts." She walked out without another word, but she stood for a moment on the boardwalk outside the dry goods store with the flour sack held against her chest and let herself understand what was actually happening. Her father had just offered her sisters as prizes. He had said any daughter, because it sounded more generous that way. But everyone in Red Hollow knew, she knew, that when Silas Granger said any daughter, he meant Clara or Eliza. The possibility of anyone choosing Rosalie was, in the working logic of Red Hollow, not a possibility worth naming. She went home and made bread, and didn't say anything to anyone. Wyatt Mercer rode into Red Hollow on a Tuesday with $43, a good horse, a rifle that had belonged to his father, and no particular plan. He was 34 years old and had been drifting for going on 6 years. Not running from anything specific, just moving. He'd worked cattle drives out of Texas, spent a winter trapping in the Northern Territories, done 2 seasons of mine work that he'd quit before the dust started to settle permanently in his lungs. He wasn't unhappy. He also wasn't exactly happy. He was in that specific state of a man who has been moving so long that stopping feels strange, but he can feel the need for it gathering somewhere in his chest like weather. Red Hollow wasn't his destination. He hadn't had a destination in a while. He'd just been following a road that went this direction, and this was where it had ended. He heard about the bear within 20 minutes of tying his horse at the livery. Couldn't avoid it. The bear was what the town was talking about, the way a town sometimes gets fixed on one thing and can't let go of it. He heard about Silas Granger's offer at the livery itself, from the man who took his horse, who told him about it the way you tell a stranger about the local trouble, with a kind of proprietary pride in the drama. "Any one of his daughters," the liveryman said. Two of them are something to look at. I'll tell you that much. What about the third one? Wyatt asked. He didn't know why he asked it. Something in the way the man had said two of them. The liveryman made a face, not mean exactly, just dismissive in the way of someone stating an obvious fact. Rosalie? She's the oldest. She's, he waved a hand. Different. Different how? The man looked at him like the question was strange. Just different, you'll see. Wyatt didn't think much more about it. He got a meal, got a room at the boarding house, and spent the afternoon sitting on the front porch watching the town go about its business, while he thought about whether he was going to stay a week or a month, or pass on through in 2 days like he usually did. He was still on the porch when Silas Granger came to find him. Silas had apparently made inquiries, asked around about the stranger who'd just arrived, learned that Wyatt had done some hunting, concluded that this was a useful person to cultivate. He introduced himself with a handshake that was designed to establish dominance and an expression that was designed to suggest he was doing Wyatt a favor by speaking to him. "Heard you've done some hunting," Silas said, settling himself into the chair next to Wyatt without being invited. "Serious hunting, not just deer." "Some," Wyatt said. "I've got a proposition." Silas laid it out. The bear, the orchard, the reward. He described his daughters with the same tone a man might use to describe livestock he was considering selling. An inventory of their positive qualities, their appearances, their general suitability. He mentioned Clara last, and let his voice carry a particular warmth when he said her name, which made his meaning clear without him having to state it directly. "So you'd give me a daughter," Wyatt said, "if I kill the bear." "Whichever one you want." Wyatt looked out at the street. A woman was crossing it with a flour sack. He didn't know yet who she was. Moving carefully because the street was muddy from the previous night's rain, picking her way around the worst of it. There was something deliberate about how she moved, unhurried, competent. "You got a map of your land?" Wyatt asked. "And the ridgeline above it?" "I'd want to see the terrain before I agreed to anything." Silas blinked. That wasn't the question he'd expected. "I can describe it." "A map would be better." Silas described it anyway. Wyatt listened and asked questions, specific ones, about elevation, about water sources, about where the damage had been concentrated. Silas answered what he could and fumbled on the rest, and Wyatt noticed the fumbling. A man who didn't know his own land. "Interesting." "I'll think on it," Wyatt said. Silas stood, adjusting his coat. "Don't think too long. There's other men interested." There probably weren't. The town had been living with this bear for 3 seasons and nobody had done anything about it, which meant either it was genuinely too dangerous or the reward wasn't sufficient motivation. Wyatt guessed both were true. He kept thinking on it through dinner and couldn't say exactly why he was still thinking about it at all. He wasn't planning to stay in Red Hollow. He had no use for a wife. Wasn't ready for that, wasn't sure he'd ever be. But something about the shape of the problem interested him, not the reward. The bear itself. A predator that had survived 3 seasons of men wanting it dead was an unusual animal, and unusual animals were interesting to Wyatt in a way that most people found hard to understand. He went to bed still undecided and woke up at 5 in the morning to the sound of the town going quiet after the last drunk had found his way home, and lay in the dark and thought about the woman crossing the street with the flour sack, and how she'd moved like someone who knew exactly where to put her feet. He found his answer, though he didn't know it yet, in a coincidence that wasn't really a coincidence. The next morning, he walked out to the Granger property, not to accept the offer, just to look at the land. Silas wasn't there. He'd gone into town for something. The younger daughters were visible through the kitchen window, moving around in what looked like a comfortable, unhurried way that suggested they spent a lot of time indoors. Wyatt walked around the side of the house toward the orchard and found Rosalie Granger standing between 2 rows of apple trees with a notebook open in one hand and a piece of charcoal in the other, making notes. She heard him coming and turned, and there was no alarm in it. Just the steady readiness of someone accustomed to dealing with whatever appeared, because things were always appearing. "Mr. Granger isn't here," she said. "I know. I came to look at the orchard." She studied him for a moment. He was aware of being assessed in the specific, unself-conscious way of someone who has learned to evaluate things accurately because inaccurate evaluation has consequences. "You're the drifter my father talked to yesterday." "Wyatt Mercer." "Rosalie Granger." She didn't offer her hand, just said the name, flat and informational. "You have damage up here on the north end," Wyatt said, because he could see it from where he stood. The torn bark on 2 trees, the disturbed soil, the obvious path of something large moving through. "4 trees hit 2 nights ago," she said. "One of them is probably going to lose the main scaffold branch. I'm going to have to make a decision about it before the end of the week." The bear come through often?" She looked at him with an expression that he would come to recognize over time, a particular compression of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite skepticism, somewhere between the two. "Yes." "Your father told me about it. He couldn't tell me much about the terrain above the ridgeline." "No," she said. "He wouldn't be able to." Something in the way she said it, not bitter, just accurate, made Wyatt look at her more carefully. She was looking at the damaged trees again, making a note in the notebook. He watched her hand move across the page and couldn't read the writing from where he stood, but he could see it was dense, organized, precise. "You know the ridgeline?" he asked. She stopped writing, looked at him again with that same assessment. "Why do you want to know?" "Because if I'm going to go after that bear, I want to know the terrain better than it does, and your father can't help me with that." He paused. "You can, can't you?" It wasn't quite a question. She heard that it wasn't. "I've been tracking it for 8 months, she said. Flat. No particular pride in it, no performance, just a fact she was delivering. Wyatt felt something sharpen in him, the particular quality of attention that came when a situation turned out to be more interesting than he'd thought. 8 months, he repeated. "I have maps, routes it uses, where it comes from, where it seems to go back to, which nights it's more likely to come and which ones it isn't." She watched his face while she said it, and he understood she was watching for the specific expression most people gave her when she said things like this. The dismissal, the slight reorientation away from her, the look that said they'd heard her but weren't going to engage with it because the source wasn't worth engaging with. He didn't give her that expression. He was too interested in what she was saying to bother with anything else. "Can I see the maps?" he asked. She didn't show him right away. She wasn't stupid. She'd offered what she knew to people before and had it disregarded, and she wasn't going to hand her 8 months of work to a stranger who might walk it over to Silas and present it as his own thinking. "Why?" she asked. "Because I'd like to know if what I'm looking at matches what you know." He gestured toward the ridge. "I've been hunting a long time. I can read terrain. But 8 months of observation beats 2 hours of looking, and I'd rather know what I'm going into." She considered this. The notebook was still open in her hand. "What are you actually here for, Mr. Mercer? You don't seem like a man who needs a wife." The directness of it caught him off guard in a way that he realized he appreciated. Most people in towns like this talked around things for a long time before they got to them. "Honestly, I'm not sure yet. Your father's offer doesn't interest me much. The bear does." "Why?" "Because it's survived 3 years of people wanting it dead. That's unusual." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the notebook and said, "Come back tomorrow morning, early, before my father is up." He nodded. "I'll be here." He was turning to go when she said, "Mr. Mercer." He turned back. "Don't tell my father I spoke to you about the tracking. He doesn't know I've been doing it." "Why not?" She looked at him with an expression that contained something tired and something harder beneath the tired. "Because it wouldn't matter to him if he knew, and I don't want to give him the chance to tell me to stop." Wyatt nodded once. "All right." He walked back through the orchard the way he'd come, and he thought about a man who didn't know his own land, and a woman who knew it better than anyone and had to do it in secret, and the particular arithmetic of a household where one person did the essential work and was counted as the least essential person. He didn't like that arithmetic. He never had. He came back the next morning at 5:45 and found her already at the fence line with a lantern and the notebook and a second notebook he hadn't seen before, this one older and more battered. They stood at the fence and she spread the maps on a flat-top post, and he leaned over them and looked, and the first thing he felt was a clean, uncomplicated shock at how good they were. Hand-drawn, careful, to scale as best she could manage it. She'd paced out distances. She'd used landmarks. She'd marked elevation changes with a system of small lines that were simple but effective. The bear's routes were traced in a darker line with dates along them. The den site, she suspected, was marked with a question mark, but with 3 lines of reasoning beside it in her small, dense handwriting. "You did all of this alone?" he said. "Yes. In 8 months. More or less. Some of it I knew before I started writing it down." He straightened up and looked at the ridge. In the early morning light, it was a dark shape against a gray sky, and somewhere up there the Gray King was either sleeping or moving, indifferent to the town's frustration with it. "You could have used this to go after it yourself," he said. "No," she said simply. "I couldn't have." He understood she didn't mean physically. He didn't say anything about that. "This question mark," he said, pointing. "Your best guess at the den. There's a ravine about 2 miles northeast, rock formation on the north side. You can't see it until you're close, but there's a natural overhang. I found hair, I found scat, I found a carcass from last winter that I think it cached." She paused. "I haven't gone in close enough to confirm. I went alone and I wasn't willing to take that risk." "Reasonable," he said. "Most people don't think so. Most people haven't tracked a problem predator alone for 8 months either." He turned to look at her. "What do you want from this, Miss Granger, if I use your information to find it?" She looked at him steadily. "I want the orchard damage to stop." "That's all?" "That's all I'm expecting." The way she said it, not bitterly, just accurately, with that same flat precision, landed somewhere in his chest and stayed there. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything you know about how it moves." She told him. For the next hour and a half they stood at that fence while the sun came up behind the ridge and the orchard woke up around them, and she talked, and he listened. She described the pattern in the timing. 4 to 6 days between major incidents, rarely 2 nights in a row. She described the approach routes, the way the damage was always concentrated on the trees closest to the ridge. The one time she'd seen it from a distance and had stood completely still for 11 minutes while it worked through a row of trees 40 yards away. "You stood still for 11 minutes while it was 40 yards away?" he said. "Yes." "And it didn't notice you?" "No, the wind was right. And I was quiet." She said it without any apparent awareness that this was remarkable, as though standing still 11 minutes 40 yards from a problem bear was just a thing a person did when the situation called for it. Wyatt had spent a lot of time around men who performed toughness. The performance was always loud and usually hollow. Rosalie Granger wasn't performing anything. She was just telling him what had happened. "Show me where you were standing," he said. She led him into the orchard through rows of trees that she touched as she passed them. Not affectionately exactly, just with the automatic attention of someone who checks on things without thinking about it, who has been responsible for something for so long that awareness of it is just part of how she moves through space. She showed him the spot. He stood in it and looked at the trees she'd pointed to and thought about the angles and the ground cover and the likely approach. "From here," he said, working it through. "It would come from the northeast, stay low on that side, until it gets to the fence line," she said. "Then it comes straight in. It's not afraid of fences." "No," he agreed. "It wouldn't be." He turned. "Miss Granger, I'm going to be honest with you. Using what you've given me, I've got a real chance at this. Better than any chance I'd have without it." He paused. "That matters to me. I don't like taking something without being straight about what I'm taking." She was looking at the trees. "All I want is for it to stop coming. I heard you the first time. I'm just telling you I'm aware of what your information is worth." She turned to look at him then, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. As though the concept of someone naming the value of what she'd contributed was slightly unfamiliar in a way that required adjustment. "All right," she said, "then thank you for saying so." They walked back through the orchard in the early morning light, and from the house came the sound of Clara's voice, high and bright, calling about breakfast. And Rosalie's shoulders shifted. Barely, just a degree. And she became slightly smaller, slightly more contained, in the way of someone stepping back into a role they know by heart. "I should go in," she said. "I'll start on the ridge tomorrow," Wyatt said. "Day after at the latest. I may need to ask you more questions." "I'll be here," she said. "I'm always here." He watched her walk back to the house and thought about the distance between what a person contributes and what they're credited for, and how long you could do essential work without it ever being seen before it carved something permanent out of you. He was still thinking about it when he got back to the boarding house, and still thinking about it when he cleaned his rifle that afternoon, sitting on the porch in the late sun while the town went about its business around him, certain of itself and certain of what everything was worth, and completely, consistently, comprehensively wrong about Rosalie Granger. Wyatt spent the first day on the ridge alone. He went up before dawn with his rifle and a canteen and the mental map he'd built from Rosalie's notes, picking his way through the dark timber by feel and instinct, stopping every 20 minutes to listen. The ridge was rougher than it looked from below. Broken ground, loose shale on the upper sections, ravines that cut sideways across the slope and made the going slow. He could see why a bear up here would feel untouchable. The terrain itself was defense enough. He found the first sign mid-morning. Scat, maybe 3 days old, exactly where Rosalie had marked on her map. Then a rub tree, a big lodgepole pine with the bark stripped 4 feet up, the wood beneath gouged deep. He put his hand against the exposed wood and felt the grooves left by the claws and thought about the animal that had made them. A large male, old enough to have lost some of the anxiety that kept younger bears cautious, confident, established. This was his territory, and he knew it the way you know the rooms of a house you've lived in for decades. He came back down at dusk without having seen the animal, but with a much clearer sense of where it moved and why. He went to the boarding house, ate, and sat on the porch in the dark going through everything Rosalie had told him against what he'd seen himself, checking it, looking for the places where the 2 pictures fit together and the places where they didn't. They fit almost everywhere. The few places they didn't were places where the terrain had probably changed. A deadfall here, a new water cut there, and those were easy to account for. He was up the ridge again by 4 the following morning. This time he went northeast, toward the ravine she'd marked with the question mark, the suspected den site. He moved more carefully now, slower, stopping longer. He wasn't ready to go close yet. He wanted to know the approaches first, wanted to have the wind figured out before he committed himself to anything. He spent 4 hours working the outer area of where she thought the den was, reading the ground, finding the trails that converged in that direction. And by the time he came down again, he was largely convinced she was right. He went to the orchard that afternoon. Rosalie was in the northern section, working on the scaffold branch she'd mentioned, the one the bear had damaged 2 nights before Wyatt arrived. She'd rigged a support for it, a forked pole wedged underneath to take some of the weight while the wound healed or didn't. She was adjusting the angle of the support when he came through the fence, and she didn't stop working when he approached, just acknowledged him with a glance and kept her hands on the pole. "Your question mark is right," he said. She set the pole and stepped back to check its position. "You found the ravine. Found trails leading to it. Found old sign. Didn't go in close, but the picture is clear." He watched her examine the branch above the support. "That going to hold?" "I don't know yet. Maybe." She pressed her palm flat against the bark below the wound, feeling something he couldn't see. "If it holds through the next 2 weeks, it'll probably be all right. If not, I'll have to take it off before it cracks and tears down." "How long have you been managing this orchard?" She looked at him briefly. "Since I was 19. 12 years. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father talks about it like it's his." "It is his," she said. The tone was flat and complicated at once. Not quite agreement, not quite something else. "My mother planted it. He owns it." "Your mother planted it," Wyatt said. She moved to the next tree, checking the trunk. "Yes." He followed her because it seemed like the conversation wasn't finished, even though neither of them had said anything that made it obviously unfinished. "What was she like, your mother?" Rosalie stopped at a tree near the fence line and ran her hand along a low branch, checking something. She knew plants, she said after a moment, the way some people know people. She could walk through here and know in 5 minutes what needed attention, and what was fine and what was going to become a problem in 6 weeks if you didn't do something about it now. She paused. She taught me to do that. You're good at it. Yes, she said. No false modesty, just yes. He almost smiled. I'm going back up tomorrow. I think I know how to approach the den. I'd like to go over the north side map with you again before I go, if you're willing. Come to the fence at 5, she said. I'll have the notebook. They met at 5 the next morning and again the morning after that. And what started as operational briefings, him asking questions about terrain, her answering from the notebooks and from her own memory, which proved as detailed and precise as the written records, started to become something else without either of them exactly deciding it should. She asked questions back. Not about hunting, initially, about him. Where he'd been, what he'd seen. She asked the way a person asks when they've spent a long time in a place and have learned things from that place, but know that they don't know everything. A genuine appetite for information about the wider world, not the affected curiosity of someone making conversation. He told her about the Northern Territories, the country up there, the scale of it, the particular quality of winter silence in an environment where the cold was serious enough to kill you if you stopped paying attention. He told her about the cattle drives, the weeks of managing animals that were fundamentally indifferent to your desire to get them somewhere specific. She listened the way she did everything, with her full attention, without performing the listening. On the 4th morning, she said, You don't talk about where you're from. No, he agreed. You don't have to. I know. He looked at the ridge. Ohio, a long time ago, farm country. My father was a decent man who worked too hard and died too young, and after that there wasn't much keeping me in one place. She nodded. No attempt to fill the space with sympathy or its performance. What keeps you here? He asked. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. The trees, she said finally, and then, more quietly, I don't have anywhere else. The second part of that sentence landed differently from the first, and he didn't pursue it. He found the den on the 5th day. He'd been approaching it for 2 mornings, tightening the circle, reading the ground, getting the wind pattern figured out. The ravine was narrower than he'd expected, and the rock formation on the north side was substantial, a genuine overhang, natural shelter, the kind of place an old bear would find and use for years. He went in from downwind, moving in increments, stopping for long minutes between moves. The bear wasn't there, but the den was occupied. Fresh bedding, recent scat, the heavy musk of an animal that slept here regularly. He spent 20 minutes in the area without moving more than 20 feet, reading everything he could read, and then backed out carefully the way he'd come. His heart was going faster than he would have liked. Not from fear exactly, though there was some of that, the clean, functional fear that kept you from doing something stupid, but from the proximity of something large and unpredictable in a confined space. He'd been that close to problem animals before. It never became routine. He came back down and went straight to the orchard. Rosalie was there. She saw his face and put down what she was carrying. You found it. Found it. He wasn't home. She let out a breath. Not relief, just the release of a question that had been sitting for a long time. The overhang. Yes, exactly where you thought. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ridge. Something moved across her face that she controlled quickly, but not quickly enough for him to miss. Something that looked like the painful satisfaction of having been right about something for a long time while no one believed you. How are you going to do it? She asked. I need to know his schedule better. He's on a rotation. Long gaps, then close intervals. You've been tracking that. He looked at her. When do you think he'll come back? She thought about it. Not performing thought, actually running the calculation against what she knew. He hit here 2 nights ago. Based on the pattern, he'll be somewhere else for another 4 or 5 days. Then the interval starts shortening. She paused. I'd guess 6 days before he comes back this direction. Which means he's at the den more consistently right now. Probably. He nodded. I'll go up in 3 days, full approach. Be ready to wait. She looked at him with that assessment again. You're going alone. Yes. Is that wise? Probably not. But there's nobody in this town I'd trust to have behind me on something like this, and someone who doesn't know what they're doing is worse than nobody. He met her eyes. You'd be the right person. You know the terrain. You're steady. He said it directly, not as flattery. But I'm not taking you in close on that. She looked at him for a moment. Because of the danger. Yes. You're not worried I can't handle it. I saw your notebooks, he said. You stood 40 yards from that animal for 11 minutes and didn't move. You can handle most things. He paused. But the ravine is a bad place to be if something goes wrong. Limited exits, rough ground. I'm not taking anyone in there who doesn't have to be there. She was quiet. Then, all right. I'll need you on the approach, though. Above the ravine, where you can cover the north exit if he breaks that way. With a rifle. She looked at him steadily. I have a rifle. I know. Can you use it? Yes, she said. Same flat precision as always. Not like a hunter, but I can hit what I aim at inside 40 yards. That's enough. He held her gaze. I'm asking you to do this with me, not because I need someone there to rescue me, because you've earned the right to be part of finishing what you started. The thing that happened to her face then was something he'd only get one look at, because she composed it quickly. But for one unguarded moment, something opened in her expression. Surprise, and something rawer than surprise. Something that looked like a person unexpectedly encountering the thing they'd stopped expecting. Then it closed again. Tell me where you want me to be, she said. They went over the plan twice that evening and once more the following morning. She knew the terrain above the ravine and could get to the position he described without difficulty. They agreed on signals, 2 quick whistles if he needed her to move, silence otherwise. She would wait at the overlook above the north exit and watch for movement. The night before he went up, Wyatt sat on the boarding house porch and allowed himself to be honest about the risk. The Grey King was an old male, probably 400 pounds, accustomed to winning confrontations with everything it had ever met. The ravine was confined, and the ground was bad. If Wyatt's shot was anything less than exactly right, the sequence of events after that would be fast and bad. He wasn't afraid of dying. He'd had that particular accommodation with himself for a long time. But he found, sitting on the porch in the quiet, that he was more concerned about the outcome than he usually was when he went into something dangerous, and he traced that back to the orchard, and the fence line, and the notebooks, and a woman who had done everything right for 12 years and deserved to have something in her life finally go the way it should. He didn't want to fail her. That was new. Bad. The morning they went up, Rosalie was at the fence at 4:15 with her rifle in a canteen and the old battered notebook tucked inside her coat. She was dressed for the terrain, practical, no concession to anything other than what the work needed. He noted the rifle, a lever action, older, well-maintained. Someone had taken care of it. My mother's, she said, seeing him look at it. She hunted. Good gun. Yes. They moved through the lower timber in the pre-dawn dark, and he kept pace with her and noticed again how she moved. Economical, quiet, certain of her footing even on ground she couldn't fully see. She wasn't performing competence, she just was competent, the way a person is when they've moved through a specific landscape often enough that the landscape is inside them. They separated below the ravine at a point where the terrain split. He went left toward the lower approach. She went right and up toward the overlook, moving without hesitation. He watched her go for a moment, the dark shape of her moving through darker timber, steady and sure, and then turned and began his approach. The next 40 minutes were the quietest Wyatt had ever spent. He moved in increments, stopping, listening, checking the wind constantly against the way it shifted in the ravine. The rock formation emerged from the dark slowly as his eyes adjusted and dawn began to lighten the sky above the ridge. He could smell the bear before he saw the den, the musk, the animal heaviness of it in the cold morning air. He stopped 25 yards out and waited. 5 minutes. 10. He was crouched behind a boulder the size of a wagon wheel with his rifle up and his breathing under control, and the world was absolutely quiet. Then the bear moved. It came out of the den with the leisurely certainty of something that had never been surprised in this place. A dark, massive shape in the early light, head swinging as it cleared the overhang. Wyatt had seen bears. He'd been close to bears. This was different. The Grey King was larger than the impression he'd built from the damage and the tracks. Not grotesquely, but meaningfully. The shoulders on it, the way it moved, that unhurried quality that the liveryman's word king had actually captured correctly. Wyatt stayed still. The bear swung its head, stopped. Wyatt saw the moment the animal caught something, wind shift, some trace of him that had leaked through his careful approach. The head came up. The small eyes found the boulder. Wyatt shot. The sound was enormous in the enclosed ravine, cracking off the rock walls and coming back at him doubled. He saw the bear stagger but stay on its feet. A good hit, center chest, but not immediately decisive. And then it came at him, not fast but with a terrible committed weight, and he worked the lever and shot again. The second shot took it in the shoulder. It dropped to one knee, pushed back up, kept coming. He had one more round chambered and waited longer than felt safe, and fired at a range that he would not have chosen to fire at, and the Grey King went down hard and didn't get up. He didn't move for what felt like a long time. The echo of the shots faded. The ravine went quiet. His heart was making itself very apparent in his chest. Then, from above, 2 short whistles. Rosalie at the overlook, asking. He found his voice. "Clear," he called up. A pause. Then her voice came down, controlled but not quite steady. "Are you hurt?" "No." Another pause. Then, "All right." He sat down on the rock behind him and waited for his hands to stop their faint tremor, which they did after a few minutes, and then he got up and went to confirm what he already knew. She came down from the overlook 20 minutes later, picking her way through the ravine approach with the rifle slung over her shoulder. She stopped a few yards from the animal and looked at it for a long time. Wyatt was sitting on a rock nearby, canteen in his hand. He watched her look at the bear. Her face was doing something complicated. Marte, not grief exactly, though there was something in it that wasn't quite pure satisfaction either. Something more layered than either of those. 8 months, he said quietly. She turned and looked at him. I knew he was here the whole time. I knew where he came from and where he went and when he'd come back. She paused. I told my father in November, in February, in April. I know. He didn't listen. I know that too. She looked back at the bear. He would have listened to you. Yes, Wyatt said. He didn't try to soften it or redirect it. It was true. She was quiet for a moment. Is that why you wanted me here? When you could have just taken the information and gone yourself? He thought about how to answer that and decided to answer it straight. Partly, and partly because what you know shouldn't be invisible. You found this. That matters, and I didn't want to be the only one who knew it. She looked at him for a long, assessing moment. The morning light was coming properly now, filtering down through the pines above the ravine, and in it he could see her face clearly for the first time without the half-dark of early morning. The steadiness of it, the careful intelligence in it, the thing that had been shaped by 12 years of doing essential work without credit. Thank you, she said, quietly, not emotional, just precise. Don't thank me. You did the tracking. He stood up. We should get this down the ridge. Your father's going to want his proof. She nodded. Yes. And then, with a dry flatness that surprised a short laugh out of him, he'll find a way to make it entirely his idea. Probably, Wyatt agreed. He's good at that. They worked together for the next 2 hours getting the bear down from the ridge, neither of them pretending it wasn't difficult, neither of them complaining about it. She was stronger than she looked and smarter about the mechanics of the problem than he was, knowing the terrain, knowing where the footing would give and where it would hold. He followed her lead on 3 separate decisions about route, and she was right all 3 times. By the time they got back to the orchard fence, she was breathing hard and her coat was dirty, and there was a long scratch on her forearm from a branch she'd caught on a bad step. She looked at it once, decided it was nothing, and didn't look at it again. Let me see that, he said. It's fine. Let me see it anyway. She held out her arm with the resigned compliance of someone who knows an argument isn't worth the energy. He looked at the scratch, long but shallow, already clotting. He had a clean cloth in his pack and he used it to wipe the debris out. and she stood with the patience of someone who has dealt with worse and not made a fuss about it. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." He tied the cloth loosely around her forearm. "You'll want to clean that properly when you get inside." "I've had worse," she said. "I expect you have." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, or could read but wasn't sure he was reading correctly. Something considering, something that was aware of itself considering and was uncomfortable with that awareness. "Mr. Mercer," she started. "Wyatt?" She stopped, processed the correction. "Wyatt." The name sat in the air between them for a moment. "You should know that my father is going to make a great deal of this. The announcement, the choosing." She said it carefully, each word placed deliberately. "He'll expect you to choose Clara." "I know that." She looked at him steadily. "Clara's a nice girl. She's 19 and she deserves to have a choice in who she marries, which my father doesn't seem troubled by, but regardless." She paused. She wouldn't be the wrong choice, practically." Wyatt looked at her. "Are you advising me on which of your sisters to marry?" Something crossed her face. "I'm being practical." "You're being practical about your own sisters." "Yes." "Rosalie." He said her name the way she'd said his. Just the name, a small weight. "I haven't decided anything yet. I have the proof I need and I'll deal with your father when the time comes." He held her gaze. "But I'd like you to stop being practical on behalf of everyone else in your life for 5 consecutive minutes." She blinked. The expression that followed was something he'd come to think of as her most unguarded one. That brief flicker of someone encountering an unexpected thing, quickly covered. "I don't know how to do that," she said, and then looked like she hadn't meant to say it quite so directly. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to figure it out by sundown. Just—" He picked up the ropes they'd used coming down the ridge. "Stop managing everyone's expectations except your own." She didn't answer that, but she also didn't argue, which he was beginning to understand was as close to agreement as Rosalie Granger usually got on things that mattered. Most. Silas Granger's reaction to the bear's death was almost everything Wyatt had expected, and a little more than he'd hoped for in its brazenness. He came out of the house when they arrived at the property line and looked at the animal, and then looked at Wyatt with the expression of a man recalculating quickly in the direction of his own benefit. His eyes passed over Rosalie with the brief, unseen quality of someone glancing at a piece of furniture. "You did it," Silas said. The satisfaction in his voice was entirely proprietorial, as though the bear's death was a vindication of his own judgment in offering the reward. "We did," Wyatt said. Silas's eyes moved to him, then to Rosalie, then back. The calculation was visible for just a moment before he covered it. "Yes. Well," he looked at the animal again. "I'll send word to town. We'll make the announcement properly. Tomorrow, I think. Gives people time to gather." "Fine," Wyatt said. Silas turned to go inside. "Come in for breakfast." In a moment, Silas went in. Clara appeared in the doorway, saw the bear, made a sound of startled excitement, and disappeared back inside. Eliza followed a moment later, looked at the scene with the specific appraisal of a young woman who understood that something significant had happened and was calculating what it meant for her. Neither of them looked at Rosalie. Rosalie was cleaning the scratch on her arm with water from the pump, her back to all of it. She moved with the same steady efficiency she brought to everything, and if the invisibility bothered her, she showed no sign of it. Or she showed exactly as much sign of it as she allowed herself to show, which Wyatt was beginning to understand was a completely different thing from not being bothered. He stood there for a moment, aware of the gap between what had just happened on the ridge and what was being registered here. The two of them moving that animal down 3 miles of broken terrain, the 2 hours of difficult work, her knowledge that had made all of it possible, and none of it being part of what anyone in that house was seeing or counting. The scratch on her arm, the dirty coat, the careful way she was cleaning her hands. He went inside to breakfast, but he carried that gap with him, and it sat in his chest all through the meal while Silas talked about the announcement, and Clara chattered about which dress she'd wear, and Rosalie served everyone else, and sat at the far end of the table and ate without being spoken to, and nobody at that table, including, he suspected, Rosalie herself, seemed to find this arrangement unusual. That bothered him more than the bear had. The announcement went through Red Hollow the way announcements always did in small towns. Fast, imprecise, and with embellishments that nobody had authorized. By the time evening came, the story had already shifted in the retelling. Some versions had Wyatt tracking the bear for a week alone on the ridge. Some had Silas himself directing the hunt from below. One version, which Wyatt heard secondhand from the boarding house keeper, had Silas claiming he'd identified the den site himself based on years of studying the animal's movements. In none of the versions that circulated through Red Hollow that evening was Rosalie Granger's name mentioned. Wyatt heard this last part from the liveryman, who told it without any awareness that it might matter. Granger says the cowboy used his knowledge of the terrain to track it down. Says he's been building a picture of that bear for months. Wyatt was brushing his horse and didn't stop. That right? Yep. Man knows his land, I guess. Wyatt set the brush down and looked at his horse for a moment. You say anything about his daughter, the older one? The liveryman made the same vague, dismissive gesture as before. Rosalie? What would he say about her? I don't know, Wyatt said. That's why I asked. He went back to brushing the horse, and the liveryman lost interest and moved on, and Wyatt stood in the quiet of the stable and felt the shape of what was coming settle over him like weather you can smell before it arrives. He'd been in enough small towns to know how these public moments worked. Silas had already decided the narrative. The announcement tomorrow was going to be theater. Silas's theater, with everyone playing the role Silas had written for them. The question was what Wyatt was going to do inside that theater. He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew he needed one before morning. Tucked. He didn't sleep well. The room at the boarding house was fine. He'd slept in worse, considerably worse, but his mind kept working the problem the way it had worked the problem of the bear, turning it, looking at it from different angles, checking for the approach that made sense. The situation was simple on its surface and complicated underneath. He had fulfilled the terms of Silas's offer. He was entitled to choose a daughter. The town expected him to choose Clara because Clara was 19 and pretty, and everyone understood that was how the logic of the offer worked in practice. Silas expected the same, had probably already planned the announcement around it, had probably already told Clara to look presentable. Rosalie expected it too. He'd seen it on her face the previous morning, that careful, preemptive management of an outcome she'd already accepted. The practical advice about Clara delivered in a tone that said she'd done the emotional work of this already, and was simply giving him the information he needed, as though her own exclusion from the consideration was a fact of the landscape, as fixed and unquestionable as the ridge above the orchard. He lay in the dark and thought about 8 months of notebooks, about 3 miles of broken ridge terrain and 2 hours of hauling a 400-pound animal down a slope and a scratch on a forearm that she'd looked at once and decided wasn't worth mentioning. About the way she moved through the orchard, touching the trees without thinking, the way she'd answered every question he'd had with precise, reliable information and no performance around it. He thought about what she'd said. I don't have anywhere else. He thought about Silas at the breakfast table, talking about the announcement while Rosalie served the food and nobody spoke to her. He wasn't a man who made decisions easily. He'd spent 6 years moving partly because moving deferred the decisions that staying required. He knew this about himself. It wasn't a flattering thing to know, but it was accurate. He had a limited appetite for the kind of commitments that couldn't be walked back. But some things, once you'd seen them clearly, didn't allow the comfort of looking away. He knew what he was going to do before he fell asleep. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't simple, and it was going to make Silas Granger furious in a public setting, which carried its own kind of risk in a town where Silas had spent decades building influence. He fell asleep anyway. The square was full by 10 in the morning. Red Hollow didn't have many occasions for gathering, and the ones it had were taken seriously. People had come in from the outlying ranches, from the farms along the valley floor, from the smaller settlements up the road. The dry goods store was closed. The saloon had put a sign in the window saying it would open at noon, after the announcement, which was optimistic about how long the drinking that followed an occasion like this would be deferred. Silas had set himself up on the steps of the Mercantile, which had the elevation advantage and the central location. He was dressed in his good coat, the one he wore to occasions where he wanted to be taken seriously, and he had his two younger daughters arranged beside him with the studied casualness of a man who had thought carefully about where to position his assets. Clara was in blue. She'd done something complicated with her hair. She was aware of being looked at and handled it with the natural ease of someone who had been looked at her whole life and found it comfortable. Eliza was beside her in green, less comfortable, but managing. Rosalie was not on the steps. Wyatt saw her when he came into the square. She was at the edge of the gathering, near the side of the feed store, in her work clothes because apparently nobody had thought to tell her to change. Or she'd thought about changing and decided it would look like she was trying for something, which was worse than not trying. He didn't know which. He only knew she was standing at the edge of her own family's public moment, like a person who has learned to take up as little space as possible. He made his way through the crowd. People clapped him on the shoulder, said things he acknowledged without really hearing. He was tracking two things simultaneously, Silas on the steps and Rosalie at the edge, and running through the sequence of what was about to happen and what he was going to do inside it. He reached the front of the crowd, and Silas saw him and raised his arms. "All right, people," Silas called out, and the square gradually settled into attention. "All right." Wyatt Mercer came to Red Hollow with nothing but a rifle and a reputation, and he went up on that ridge and he did what none of us managed to do in 3 years. He paused for effect. "The Great King is dead." The crowd responded. Not quite a cheer, something more complex, the collective release of 3 years of accumulated anxiety about an animal that had cost people money and sleep and 2 lives. It was genuine, whatever else Silas was doing with it. "I made a promise," Silas continued, his voice settling into the register of a man delivering something he'd rehearsed. "I'm a man of my word. Wyatt Mercer gets his pick of my daughters." He gestured at Clara and Eliza with a proprietary sweep. "Anyone he chooses." Clara smiled at Wyatt. It was a real smile, nervous, genuine. She was 19 and she didn't deserve what her father was doing with her life, and she also didn't fully understand what her father was doing with her life, which was the particular tragedy of her situation. Wyatt looked at her and felt the weight of how much easier the next 30 seconds would be if he just said her name. He didn't say her name. He looked out at the square, at the people watching him, and then he looked at the edge of the crowd where Rosalie was standing with her arms at her sides, and the expression of someone who has made themselves very still, because stillness is the only control available. He turned back to Silas. "I appreciate the offer," he said, loud enough to carry. "Before I answer, I want to ask you something." Silas's smile held, but something shifted behind it. "Sure." "The tracking work, the maps, the 8 months of watching where that bear moved and where it came from and where it denned." He kept his voice even. "Who did that?" A silence. Not the comfortable kind. Silas's smile went up a fraction, the way a man's smile goes when he's deciding how much of a problem something is. "I've been watching that animal for—" "Who did it?" Wyatt said again. Not aggressively, just clearly, repeating the question because the question hadn't been answered. People in the crowd were looking at each other. The shift was subtle, but it was there. The particular attention of a community that has just registered that something unexpected is happening. Silas said, "A man learns his land over years, Mercer. You use what you—" "Rosalie drew the map," Wyatt said. The square went quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a pause. The specific quiet of a crowd that has heard something that doesn't fit the story they were following. Silas's expression went through several things in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and then a particular kind of contemptuous dismissal that he deployed when something threatened his authority. "Now, Rosalie helps around the property. Sure, she's always had a—" "She tracked that bear for 8 months, Wyatt said. "She identified the den site. She mapped the routes. Without what she gave me, I wouldn't have known where to go." He paused. "She was on the ridge with me when I made the kill. She had the north exit covered. She came down with me afterward." He looked out at the crowd. "Some of you know Rosalie Granger. She's been running that orchard for 12 years. I'd like to know why she's standing at the edge of this gathering instead of up here where she belongs." Nobody answered that. The silence had a different quality now. Not just surprise, but something edging toward discomfort. The specific discomfort of a community that is being asked to see something it has been comfortable not seeing. Silas recovered faster than Wyatt had expected, which told him something about how practiced Silas was at recovering in public. Rosalie has always been part of this family, he said, with the warmth of a man performing warmth. Nobody said otherwise. He looked at Wyatt with an expression that was still smiling and no longer friendly underneath. Now, you've fulfilled your end. Pick your bride, Mercer. Wyatt looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the edge of the crowd. Rosalie, he said. Another silence. This one was different from the first, sharper, faster to arrive, with an edge to it. Silas's smile didn't move, but something happened behind his eyes, a rapid interior calculation, and then something that Wyatt didn't expect. He laughed. It started low and built, and it wasn't a warm laugh or a surprised laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has just had an idea and is deploying it. He turned to the crowd with his arms spread, inviting them into the joke. Well, Silas said, and the laugh was still in his voice. Well, isn't that... Look at this. He reached out and grabbed Rosalie by the arm. She'd moved closer when Wyatt said her name, had come in from the edge, and was now close enough for Silas to reach. He pulled her forwards, not gently, and presented her to the crowd with the same gesture he'd used to present Clara and Eliza, except this one had contempt in it, and he wasn't hiding the contempt. The man wants Rosalie. The man wants my Rosalie. He said it like it was the punchline of something, and he looked at the crowd expecting them to join him in the joke. Some of them did. A laugh went through part of the crowd. Not everyone, but enough to hear, enough to land. A few people looked away. Mrs. Potts from the dry goods store laughed loud enough to be noticed. Rosalie stood where her father had put her, very still, and her face was controlled in the way of someone who has had long practice at controlling it under conditions that made control difficult. But she wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at Wyatt, and her expression had something in it that he read, quickly and clearly, as not pity for herself but something closer to alarm on his behalf. The look of someone who is worried about what someone else has just done to themselves. Silas let the laugh settle, and then looked at Wyatt with satisfaction dressed up as magnanimity. Fine by me, he said. If that's your choice, Cowboy, she's yours. He pushed Rosalie slightly forward, a small motion that was somehow worse than a larger one would have been. The casualness of it. Lord knows nobody else is going to want her. The crowd went quieter than it had been. Not quite comfortable with that last line. Not comfortable enough to push back against it either. Wyatt looked at Silas for a long moment. He was aware of his own anger, and he was managing it, because anger in this moment would be a gift to Silas. Would make him dramatic and easy to dismiss. What he needed to be was calm, specific, unmovable. Thank you, Wyatt said to Silas, in a tone that declined to acknowledge the joke. He turned to Rosalie. The alarm was still in her face. You don't have to say yes, he said, quietly enough that it was mostly between them, though the square was quiet enough that people near the front probably heard it. I'm not asking you as part of any arrangement. I'm asking you because I want to. She looked at him. Her expression was doing too many things at once for him to read them all. The careful composure she maintained and something underneath it that the composure was holding back, and the particular conflict of a person who wants something and has long since decided that wanting things leads to worse outcomes than not wanting them. Wyatt, she said, just his name, low. You don't have to decide right now, he said. But I meant what I said. That's why I'm asking. The crowd was watching this with the arrested attention of people witnessing something that has departed from the script they came prepared for. Silas was watching it too, and he had shifted from satisfied to uncertain in a way he was covering with an expression of amused tolerance. This is real sweet, Silas said, with an edge under the sweetness. But I'll remind you, Mercer, she's not exactly, I mean to say, you could have had Clara. I know what I could have had, Wyatt said, and looked at Silas directly now, and let the look be clear about what he thought of the framing. I know exactly what I could have had. Silas held the look for a moment, and then did something Wyatt hadn't anticipated. He straightened and looked at the crowd and made a decision. Wyatt could see it being made. And the decision was to take control of the narrative the only way available to him, which was to make it seem like the outcome was what he'd intended all along. Fine, Silas said expansively to the crowd. Fine. My Rosalie gets a husband. Every man makes his own choices. The implication in the word choice was meant to carry, that Wyatt's was a poor one, but the implication was slightly less comfortable to deploy than it had been a moment ago, because the crowd had seen the thing Wyatt said, and the way Rosalie's face had moved when he said it, and something in the calculation of the room had shifted. Not dramatically, not completely. Red Hollow had years of habit around Rosalie Granger, and habits didn't dissolve in 60 seconds. But something had moved. Rosalie was looking at the ground. Her hands were at her sides. Wyatt took a step toward her, not touching, not crowding, just near enough to be clearly beside her rather than across from her. "Are you all right?" he said, quiet. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry. She wasn't going to cry here. He understood that without needing to be told. She wouldn't give the square that. But there was something in them that was the structural equivalent of what crying would have been, something that cost her to hold in place. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, also quiet. "Probably not," he agreed. "They're laughing at you now." Some of them were always going to laugh, doesn't change anything. She looked at him with that assessing expression, checking him for something. For sincerity, he thought. For the evidence that this was real and not a performance, not pity dressed up as something more interesting. "You could have had Clara," she said, and it was an echo of what Silas had said, but in her mouth it meant something entirely different. Not manipulation, just a factual accounting of his options that she was laying out because she'd never been able to stop being practical. "I didn't want Clara," Wyatt said. "She's beautiful." "So are the maps you drew," he said. "That's not the point." Something crossed her face at that. Not quite a smile, but the neighborhood of one, the shape the muscles around her mouth made when something landed that she hadn't expected. "That's a very strange thing to say," she said. "I know, it's what I've got." The gathering broke up in the way of gatherings that have gotten more complicated than they came prepared for. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in clusters of people who needed to process what they'd seen by talking to each other about it somewhere else. Wyatt heard pieces of conversations as people moved around him. Most of them he let pass without tracking. A few stuck. From two men near the saloon steps. Don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he's simple. He didn't look simple to me. No, he didn't. From Mrs. Potts to someone Wyatt didn't recognize. Well, she won't exactly be a pretty bride. And then, a beat later, with less certainty than the first statement, though she has kept that orchard running. I'll give her that. From old Dale Cutter, who ran the farrier's shop and had lived in Red Hollow longer than anyone, Silas Granger is about the luckiest man in this valley right now and doesn't know it. That girl's been holding his land together since she was 19 years old. Wyatt heard this one because Dale said it within 3 feet of him, and when Wyatt looked at him, Dale met his eyes and nodded once. "She's worth 10 of the other 2, Dale said, directly to Wyatt. "Any man with sense can see it." "Thank you," Wyatt said. "Don't thank me, just don't be stupid about it." "What?" The part of the day that Wyatt had not fully planned for was the afterward. The public moment was one thing. He'd thought it through, made his choice, stood by it. What he hadn't thought through as carefully was what happened on the walk back to the Granger property with Rosalie beside him and the town behind them, and the reality of what had just been set in motion settling around both of them like dust after a disturbance. Silas had gone ahead with Clara and Eliza, which was either a deliberate slight or a practical convenience, possibly both. They were alone on the road, and the silence between them was not unfriendly, but it was dense. "You're going to want to know what you're actually getting into," Rosalie said after they'd gone a quarter mile. "I expect so," Wyatt said. "I'm not—" She stopped, tried again. "I don't know how to do what you're apparently asking me to do." "Which is what?" "This." A gesture between them. "Whatever this is." She said it without any effect, just a frank acknowledgement of confusion. "I don't think either of us knows exactly what this is yet," Wyatt said. "I don't think that's a problem right now." "I'm 31 years old," she said. "I know. I've never—" She stopped again. Wyatt didn't push. I'm 34, he said. I've spent 6 years not staying anywhere. I'm not asking you to fit into something I have built because I haven't built anything. I'm not offering you something finished. He looked at her. I'm just telling you that what I said back there was true. She walked for a moment without speaking. The road was dry, and the afternoon had gotten warm, and somewhere in the distance a hawk was working the air above the valley. Why? She asked. That's what I can't... Why? He thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated, and some parts of it were too early to say. Because you know things, he said finally. Real things, things that matter, and you've been doing them right for a long time and not gotten anything for it. He paused. That's not a reason to feel sorry for you. It's a reason to pay attention to you. She was quiet again. The Granger property came into view. The house, the outbuildings, the orchard spreading out beyond. My father is going to make the next weeks very difficult, she said. I imagine so. He doesn't like losing things he thinks he controls. I got that. And the town? The town will think what it thinks. It'll change over time or it won't. I can't do anything about it either way. She looked at him sidelong. You're very calm about all of this. I'm not entirely, he said honestly. I'm working at it. Something shifted in her face when he said that. The admission of effort, maybe. The acknowledgement that this cost something to hold together. It seemed to reach her in a way that the confident version wouldn't have. All right, she said, which was what she said when she'd finished processing something and arrived somewhere she could stand. All right. Silas found his moment that evening. He waited until Wyatt was in the kitchen, which was Silas's domestic territory, the room where his authority in the household felt most consolidated. Clara and Eliza had gone upstairs. Rosalie was in the orchard. She'd gone out after dinner to check the scaffold support she'd rigged on the damaged tree. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of Wyatt and sat down across from him with the manner of a man who has decided to have a frank conversation, which meant a conversation that would be entirely on his terms. I'm going to be straight with you, Silas started. All right. What you did today, he paused, rephrased. The choice you made. I respect a man who makes his own choices. He didn't say it in a way that indicated actual respect, but I want to know what you're thinking. I think I was fairly clear about what I was thinking, Wyatt said. Rosalie is... Silas turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was careful, Wyatt noticed, about what words he chose in this conversation, careful in a way he hadn't been in the square. The public humiliation was one thing. The private one required more management. She's not an easy woman. She's set in her ways. She has opinions. I noticed, Wyatt said. She's never going to be... Silas searched for the word. Decorative. I'm not looking for decorative. Silas looked at him with the expression of a man who genuinely cannot understand the sentence he has just heard. You sure about that? Clara is... I'm sure, Wyatt said. Silas leaned back. The calculation was visible again, the quick interior arithmetic of a man figuring out what angle gives him the best return. You'd be doing her a kindness, you know, Rosalie. She's not going to get another offer. This is the best thing for her, really. He said it with the practiced ease of someone who has long since learned to frame whatever serves his interests as what's best for someone else. Wyatt looked at him. Mr. Granger, I'd like to ask you something directly. Sure. How much do you actually know about what Rosalie does in that orchard? Silas's expression shifted. I own that land. I know it. Which variety planted along the east fence grafts at what age? Silence. Which trees are showing the early signs of fire blight that she's managing before it spreads to the main block? More silence. When did the water table under the north section drop, and what did she do to compensate for it? Silas set his coffee cup down. That's not... A man delegates. You can't expect... She told me these things, Wyatt said, in passing. The way you talk about things that are part of how you think, she carries all of it. He held Silas's gaze. Every piece of knowledge that keeps that orchard producing is in her head, has been for 12 years, and you stood in front of your whole town today and talked about your knowledge of your land. The room was very quiet. Silas's face went through something. Several things. Anger first, then something more uncertain, and then the particular set of a man who has been caught and is deciding whether to acknowledge it or simply exit the situation. He chose exit. He picked up his coffee, stood, and said, "She's a good worker. I'll give her that," in a tone that managed to make it sound like a concession when it was actually a retreat. He left the kitchen. Wyatt sat with his coffee and listened to the sound of the house settling around him and the faint sounds from outside where Rosalie was still in the orchard in the last of the evening light, tending to her trees with the same attention she brought to everything, aware of it all and counted for none of it. That was going to change. He didn't know yet exactly how, but it was going to change. Oh. He found her at the damaged tree when he went out, 20 minutes later. She'd adjusted the scaffold support again, got the angle slightly better, was standing back looking at it with the critical eye of someone who has done all they can for now and is making their peace with uncertainty. She heard him coming and didn't turn. "He talked to you?" "Yes." "What did he say?" "That you're not decorative." She made a short sound, not quite a laugh. "He's right about that." "He is." Wyatt stopped beside her and looked at the tree. In the evening light, the damage was easier to see than in the morning. The torn bark, the angle of the compromised branch, the support she'd rigged. "You think it'll hold?" "I think maybe. The branch wants to hold. I just need to give it the chance." She looked at it for another moment. "That's most of what the work is, knowing what wants to survive and getting out of its way." He thought about that. "That's a different philosophy than most people have about orchards." "Most people who talk about orchards don't spend time in them," she said. He almost smiled. Then he said, "I meant what I said today. Every part of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said finally. "That's the part I don't know what to do with." "You don't have to do anything with it yet. You stood up in front of the whole town, and they laughed at you, Wyatt, because of me. Some of them. It'll be worse. You don't know this town the way I do. They'll—" "Rosalie?" He said it the way he'd said it in the square. Just her name, a specific weight. "I've been in enough places to know that a town's opinion of a person and a person's actual worth are two different things." He looked at her. "I'm not confused about which one matters." She turned and looked at him, and her face was in shadow now, the light fading, but he could still see the expression. That careful, assessing thing she did, checking for the gap between what someone said and what they meant, because experience had taught her the gap was usually there. She didn't find it this time. He could see her not finding it. "All right," she said, for the second time that day, in the same tone of someone who has arrived somewhere they can stand. She looked back at the tree. "I need to check the east fence before it gets fully dark." "I'll come with you," he said. She glanced at him, surprised briefly, and then nodded and turned and led him down the row, moving through her orchard with the sure-footed confidence of someone in a place they know by heart, and he followed her through the last light of the evening with the particular sense of a man who has made a decision. He can't walk back and has discovered, with something like relief, that he doesn't want to. They married 12 days later, in the practical, unadorned way of two people who were not marrying for spectacle. The ceremony was brief. Judge Harlan Oates, who handled such things in Red Hollow along with property disputes and the occasional drunk and disorderly, came to the Granger property on a Thursday morning and read the necessary words while Silas stood to one side with the expression of a man attending an event he had not fully endorsed, and Clara watched from the porch steps with a look that was partly relieved and partly something she hadn't sorted out yet. Eliza didn't come down at all. Rosalie wore the same dark dress she wore to town on practical errands. She had brushed her hair and pinned it differently than usual, which was the only concession she made to the occasion, and she stood straight during the reading with her hands at her sides and said the required words in a clear, even voice that didn't waver. Wyatt said his. He meant them. He wasn't sure yet what the full scope of meaning them would require, but he meant them. Afterward, there was no celebration. Silas shook Wyatt's hand with the firm grip of a man closing a transaction and went inside. Clara hugged Rosalie briefly and said something quiet that made Rosalie's expression do something brief and complicated before it settled again. Judge Oates left. The morning continued. Wyatt had taken a room at what would eventually be called his property, a small parcel 2 miles from the Granger land that he'd purchased with most of what he had, a modest house and a barn, and enough land to be called a ranch if you were being generous with the word. It needed work. The roof on the barn had a section that was going to be a problem before winter. The kitchen needed the flue cleaned. The south pasture fence was down in 2 places. He had shown it to Rosalie before the wedding, walking her through the house room by room, not describing it with any particular pride because it didn't warrant pride yet. She had looked at everything with her assessing eye, opened cabinet doors, tested floorboards with her weight, looked at the kitchen garden and noted what had been planted and what hadn't. "The soil here is different from the Granger land," she'd said by the kitchen garden. "Less clay. You'd want to work in some organic matter before you planted anything substantial." "I know," he'd said. "I haven't had time yet." "No?" She'd looked around. "It's workable," which from Rosalie he'd understood was something close to enthusiasm. The arrangement they fell into after the wedding was practical first and personal around the edges, which was the only way either of them knew how to do things. She came to the house and began organizing it with the systematic efficiency of someone who understood that a house is a set of systems, and the systems either work or they don't. He worked on the barn roof, and the fences, and the things that required physical correction, and they moved through the shared space of the property each day with the particular careful awareness of 2 people who don't know each other's rhythms yet and are paying attention. It was not easy. He hadn't expected it to be. She was not an accommodating person in the way that the word accommodating usually meant. She didn't soften her observations or manage his feelings about them, didn't fill silence with reassurance, didn't pretend the flu wasn't a problem when the flu was clearly a problem. She said what she saw. He was finding that he preferred this to the alternative, but it took adjustment. He was not himself a person who explained himself naturally. He had spent 6 years where no explanation was required of him, and the habit of interior processing without exterior reporting was deep. She would ask him a direct question, and he would answer it accurately, but not expansively. And sometimes he'd catch her looking at him afterward with the expression of someone who had received the information they asked for, but not quite the understanding they were looking for, and he didn't always know how to bridge that. But they worked well together. That part was easy. Easier than he'd expected. She had a practical intelligence that matched his in some areas and exceeded it in others, and she was neither defensive about the areas where he knew more, nor falsely modest about the ones where she did. They could work a problem side by side without friction, which was rarer than people acknowledged. The distance between working well together and being close was the part they were still crossing. Silas started his campaign in the 2nd week. It wasn't dramatic. Silas was too smart for drama when subtlety served him better. It was a series of small things, the kind of things that could each be explained away individually, but that added up over time to a clear picture. He came to the house on a Tuesday morning while Wyatt was working on the barn. He came to talk to Rosalie, he said, family business. Wyatt left them to it and went back to the roof and didn't hear the conversation, only the shape of it. Silas's voice, low and continuous, and Rosalie's responses, which were shorter. She was quieter that evening. Not unhappy exactly. Her version of unhappy was hard to read, but thinner, somehow. Like something had pressed on her. He didn't ask. She didn't offer. They ate dinner, and he was aware that he should say something and didn't know what, which was one of the things he was still working on. The 2nd visit was on a Friday. Again, while Wyatt was occupied elsewhere. Not by coincidence, he thought. Again, Rosalie was quieter afterward. This time there was something else in it, a slight pull inward, a quality of someone reconsidering something. The 3rd visit Wyatt saw part of, because he'd come back from the south fence earlier than expected and found them in the kitchen, Silas at the table with coffee he'd apparently helped himself to, and Rosalie standing near the window with her arms crossed, which was not her usual posture. Silas looked at him when he came in and smiled the practiced smile. "Just visiting with my daughter." "I can see that," Wyatt said. He looked at Rosalie. She met his eyes for a moment and then looked at the window. "I'll let you get on," Silas said, standing. He picked up his hat. "Rosalie, think about what I said." And he left, and Wyatt stood in the kitchen listening to the sound of his horse leaving the yard. "What did he say?" Wyatt asked. Rosalie uncrossed her arms and moved to clear the coffee cups. Nothing worth repeating. That bad. She stopped with the cups in her hands and looked at him. He thinks you're going to realize your mistake, she said, flat and direct as always. He's been saying so, in different ways, each time. She set the cups in the basin. He's probably not wrong. He is wrong, Wyatt said. Wyatt, he's wrong, he said again without heat. Whatever he's been telling you, he's wrong. She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, he says Clara is still available, that it's not too late to arrange something more. She stopped. His word was suitable. Wyatt looked at her steadily. I don't want Clara. I've said so. I'll keep saying it if I have to. But why? And there it was, the question she'd been carrying for weeks, the one she hadn't asked directly until now, the one that she apparently couldn't stop asking herself. Why me? Give me a reason that makes sense, not about maps, not about the ridge. A reason. He thought about it honestly because she deserved the honest answer and not the easy one. Because you don't pretend, he said. You don't manage me. You see something wrong, and you say so. You know things, and you don't perform the knowing. He paused. I've spent a long time around people who were mostly managing the impression they were making. It's exhausting. You don't do that. She was quiet. He could see her examining the answer, checking it for the gap. That's not enough to build a life on, she said. It's a start, he said. We have time for the rest. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the basin and didn't say anything else, and he couldn't tell if he'd reached her or not. With Rosalie, sometimes the reaching happened later, when she'd had time to process it alone, and the evidence of it arrived quietly, in the way she stood the next morning, or how she handed him his coffee. He went back out to the south fence and gave her the time. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Silas's visits were doing something more than planting doubt. They were excavating something that was already there. Rosalie had been told in 1,000 ways over 31 years what she was worth. Not always in words. Silas was right that the most effective teaching didn't require words. It was in the arrangement of the table, in the quality of the fabric, in the visitors who looked past her, in the way compliments about the orchard went to Silas in front of others and became corrections to Rosalie in private. The learning had been so thorough and so long that she'd stopped being able to tell the difference between what she believed about herself and what she'd been taught, and those two things had become the same. Wyatt's choosing her had created a fissure in this, a place where the taught thing and the true thing didn't match, where she could feel the gap. But the gap was uncomfortable. It required her to hold two contradictory things at once: the evidence of Wyatt's actual behavior, which consistently said one thing, and the deep-laid knowledge of what she was worth, which said another. Silas knew how to press on that gap. He'd had 31 years of practice building it, and he understood its geography precisely. He came a fourth time, and this time Wyatt wasn't home. She didn't tell Wyatt what was said in that conversation. Later, he would piece it together from the aftermath. But in the moment it happened, she was alone with it, and she did what she'd always done with the things that came from her father. She took them in and held them with the specific kind of endurance that isn't the same as agreement, but eventually becomes indistinguishable from it. What Silas said, as best Wyatt later reconstructed it, was this: that Wyatt was a drifter who had stayed in Red Hollow longer than he'd stayed anywhere, which wasn't long, and that men like that didn't stop drifting because they'd found something. They stopped temporarily, and then the movement started again. That Rosalie would be left. That the kindest thing she could do for both of them was to leave before he had to. That there was a room at the Granger house still. It would always be there. That he had a buyer interested in Wyatt's property parcel, and she could come home and nothing would change. Nothing would change. He came back from town on a Thursday and found the house changed in a way he understood before he could have explained how. Her notebooks were gone from the table. The kitchen had a particular quality, the quality of a room where the person whose habits give it its specific character has been absent for several hours. He checked the bedroom. The small collection of her personal things, the extra dress, the hairpins, The old photograph she kept on the nightstand was gone. He stood in the bedroom for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. Then he went out to the barn, saddled his horse, and began to think about where she would go. She would go back to the orchard. It was the only place she understood herself to belong. Whatever Silas had told her, and he was beginning to put together the shape of it, the patient architecture of 4 visits. She had believed it because she'd been trained to believe it, and because some part of her had been waiting for it to be confirmed. He rode the road to the Granger property at a pace that wasn't panicked, because panic didn't help, but wasn't slow either. The sun was getting low. The valley had that quality it got in late afternoon, the light going golden and long, and the shadows of the trees stretching out east. He would have found it beautiful under different circumstances. He rode into the Granger yard, and Silas came out of the house before Wyatt had fully stopped. "She's home," Silas said, with a satisfaction he wasn't trying to hide. "Safe and sound. No harm done." Wyatt looked at him from the horse. "I need to talk to her." "She needs some time." "I need to talk to her." Silas spread his hands. "Mercer, look. No hard feelings. These things happen. You're a good man, I'm sure, but this wasn't the right fit, and where is she?" Silas's expression tightened. He wasn't used to being talked over, and he wasn't enjoying it. "She's inside, and she doesn't want—" Wyatt got off the horse. Silas stepped in front of him. Not a physical block, more an assertion of territorial authority. "Now hold on. This is my property, my house. She's my daughter." "She's my wife," Wyatt said, quietly, "and she gets to decide what she wants. I'm not here to drag her back." He held Silas's gaze. "I'm here to talk to her. If she tells me she wants to stay, I'll go. But she's going to tell me herself." Something in his voice, or his face, or the specific quality of his stillness communicated something to Silas, because after a moment Silas stepped aside. Wyatt went into the house. She was in the kitchen. Of course she was. The kitchen was the room where she had always worked, the room where her invisibility was most fully enacted and most fully accepted by her. She was standing at the work table with her hands flat on the surface, not doing anything, just standing. She heard him come in, and her shoulders changed, a slight compression, as though preparing for impact. "I'm not angry," he said, because it was true, and it was the first thing she needed to know. She turned and looked at him. Her face was controlled, but there was something behind the control that was raw and tired. "You should be," she said. "No." He came into the kitchen and pulled out a chair at the table and sat down, taking himself down to a level below hers, not standing over her. "Tell me what he said." She looked at him for a moment, then she sat down across from him, slowly, like someone who is tired in the specific way of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time. She told him. Not everything at once. It came out in pieces, the 4 conversations, the things Silas had said about drifters and temporary things, and the kindness of leaving first. And underneath the content of what she reported, he could hear the other thing, that she had believed it. Not entirely, but enough. That there was a version of her that had been waiting for the evidence that Silas was right, because Silas had always been right about her, and some part of her couldn't stop expecting it. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue with the content of what Silas had told her, because arguing with it directly was not the point yet. When she stopped, he said, "Do you want to stay here?" She blinked. "What?" "Here, in this house, with your father. Do you want to?" She looked at him with an expression that suggested the question was stranger than she'd expected. "That's not... It's a simple question. Do you want to be here, or did you come because you thought you should?" She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the kitchen settled around them, the house sounds coming in, the creak of the structure, something outside in the yard. "I thought," she started, stopped. "I thought it would be easier for you if I..." She pressed her lips together. "You could still... Clara is still... Rosalie." He put his hand on the table between them, not on hers, just on the table. Present. "I don't want easier. I want what's true." He looked at her. "Do you want to be here?" She looked at his hand on the table. Then she looked at him. "No," she said very quietly. "All right," he said. "Womp." He went to find Silas, who was in the yard by the fence doing something that was probably designed to look occupied. "I'm going to ask you to stop coming to my house," Wyatt said. Silas looked at him with the expression of a man who has lost a round but hasn't decided the match is over. "She came here on her own." "She did, because of what you told her." Wyatt held his gaze. "I know what you've been saying to her. I know what picture you've been building over 4 visits. He paused. "It stops. I'm her father. I have a right." "You have whatever relationship with her she chooses to have," Wyatt said. "That's it. That's all. If she wants you in her life, you're in it. If she decides she doesn't, you're not. But I won't have you in my house working on her like she's a problem you're trying to fix." Silas's expression went cold. The performance of genial authority dropped away, and what was underneath it was harder and less pleasant. "You don't know what you're talking about. You've been here 5 minutes. That girl has been my responsibility for 31 years, and I know how she thinks." "You know how to make her think she's less than she is," Wyatt said. "You've been doing it so long, you've confused it with knowing her." He took a breath, kept his voice even. "I'm telling you to stop." Silas looked at him with narrowed eyes. "And if I don't?" "Then I'll start asking questions about the orchard," Wyatt said. "About who owns it, and what your wife's arrangements were, and what's been put in writing and what hasn't." It was a shot in the dark. He didn't know yet what was there to find. He had only Rosalie's passing comment months ago that the orchard had been her mother's. But he'd learned to trust the weight of things that were said offhandedly, the things that came out without performance, and the orchard had come up in Rosalie's early conversations with him in a way that had an unresolved quality to it, a thing not fully resolved. He watched Silas's face. What happened there was fast and mostly controlled, but not entirely. There was a flicker, a specific kind of alertness that a man shows when a word hits somewhere tender, somewhere that matters. And then the control came back down over it, and Silas's expression went smooth and dismissive. "I don't know what you think you're implying," Silas said. "I'm not implying anything," Wyatt said. "Just telling you what I'll be looking into." He went back inside. At Gemkit. He didn't tell Rosalie what he'd said to Silas about the orchard. He wasn't sure yet why he'd said it. Instinct, mostly, the readout from that flicker on Silas's face. He didn't have anything solid yet, and he didn't want to give her something he couldn't back up. She was in the kitchen when he came back in, and her notebooks were on the table. She'd gotten them from wherever she'd put them when she arrived. The 4th one was open in front of her, but she wasn't writing in it. She was just sitting with her hands resting near it. "He's not going to come again," Wyatt said. She looked up at him. "You can't guarantee that." "I know, but I think he will." He sat down. "When you're ready, I'd like to go back home." She looked at him for a moment, that assessment, checking for the gap. Then she closed the notebook. "Now is fine," she said. They rode back in the last of the evening light, not talking much. The silence between them different from the one on the way there. Not resolved, but opened somehow. Like a window that had been stuck and had been pushed up, and now the air was moving. He made up his mind, riding back to find out what he could about Margaret Granger's arrangements. Not because he was sure of anything, because of the flicker on Silas's face, and because 12 years was a long time to run something that wasn't yours, and because Silas was too smooth a man to react that fast to something with no substance underneath it. The county seat was a day's ride. He went on a Monday, telling Rosalie he had business there and not specifying what kind. She didn't ask. She'd learned his pace on information the way he'd learned hers, the understanding of what to push on and what to leave. The county records office was in a building that smelled of old paper and lamp oil, presided over by a clerk named Watts, who was deeply unenthusiastic about his work, but thorough despite the enthusiasm deficit. Wyatt explained what he was looking for. Property records, specifically anything relating to land registered to Margaret Granger or the Granger orchard parcel in the valley. Watts went away and came back with a box. The documents were not organized with any particular system. Wyatt sat at a table and went through them methodically, the way he went through everything, and 20 minutes in he found the first thing. Margaret Granger's property, filing from 14 years ago, the year the orchard was formally registered with the county. The property was filed in her name. Margaret Eleanor Granger, sole registrant. He set that aside. 30 minutes after that, he found the second thing, which was a document he had to read twice because the first reading didn't fully land. It was Margaret Granger's testament, filed with the county recorder's office 6 months before her death. It was straightforward and brief, the handwriting careful, the language simple. She left the orchard property in its entirety, including all improvements, plantings, and associated equipment, to her eldest daughter, Rosalie Margaret Granger, to be held in her name and managed at her discretion. He read it again. The property had never been Silas's. The orchard, the 40 original trees and everything Rosalie had built it into over 12 years, every row she'd planted, every system she'd managed, every notebook she'd filled, was Rosalie's, had been Rosalie's since her mother died. He sat at the table in the records office and looked at the document and felt something settle in him that was cold and clear and not comfortable. Silas had known. Had to have known. You didn't miss a document filed against your own property. He had watched his daughter inherit land and then spent 12 years running that land through her labor, while convincing her that she was the one who owed him. Kept her there not with chains, but with the steady, patient work of making her believe she had nothing, no claim, no rights, no value that wasn't contingent on his allowance. He asked Watts if he could get a copy of both documents. Watts said yes, it would take some time. Wyatt said he'd wait. He waited 2 hours. He paid the copying fee. He put the documents in his coat. He rode back to Red Hollow thinking about what to do with what he'd found, and the answer that kept arriving was the same one. She needed to know. Not first what it meant for him, or for the property, or for their future. She needed to know what her mother had left her, and what her father had spent 12 years pretending didn't exist. He came home after dark and found Rosalie in the kitchen with her notebook and a cup of tea gone cold. She looked up when he came in. "Long day," she said. "Yes." He sat down across from her. He put the documents on the table between them. She looked at them. "What are those?" "County records," he said, "from the recorder's office at the county seat." He held her gaze. "Your mother left you the orchard, Rosalie, in writing, filed and registered 12 years ago. The property is yours." She looked at him. Then she looked at the documents. Then she looked at him again. "That's not—" She stopped. "My father. I know what your father told you. He was wrong." He slid the testament toward her. "Your name, your mother's signature, filed 6 months before she died." She picked up the document. He watched her read it. He watched her read it again. He watched the thing that happened to her face. Not one thing, but a sequence of things, each arriving before the last had finished, overlapping in a way that was hard to name except to say that it was the face of someone whose understanding of their own past is being revised at the root while they sit still. Her hands were not quite steady. He noticed and didn't comment. She set the document down. She sat very still for a moment. Outside, something moved in the yard. A nightbird, probably, or the horse shifting in the barn. "He knew," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "The whole time?" "The whole time." She looked at the documents on the table, at her name on the paper, at the careful handwriting of a woman who had been dead for 12 years and had, before she died, tried to make sure her daughter had something that was hers. "She knew," Rosalie said quieter. "She knew what he was like. She filed it separately. She didn't tell him." Wyatt hadn't thought of it that way, but he heard it as soon as she said it, and it fit. Margaret Granger, who had known her husband well enough to file a legal document in secret. Who had tried, from wherever she was going, to give her eldest daughter the thing she'd understood Rosalie was going to need. Rosalie's face was still doing the layered thing. She pressed her lips together, and he could see her holding something in, which was what she always did, and this time he thought about saying, "Let it go," and decided not to, because she wasn't ready, and because some things you hold until you're somewhere, you can afford to put them down. "What happens now?" she asked. Her voice was steady, just. "That's your decision," he said. "The property is yours. What you do with that is yours to decide." He held her gaze. "But I think the town needs to know." She looked at the documents. Then she looked at him. "You're going to take this to him," she said. "To my father." Not alone, he said. With you, in front of whoever you want present. He paused. He's been making you small in this valley for a long time. It should stop in front of the same people it happened in front of. She was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was still around them. He's my father, she said. I know. It doesn't stop being complicated because he did something wrong. I know that too, he said. I'm not asking you to stop it being complicated. I'm asking you what you want to do. She looked at the document, at her name on it, at her mother's signature, for a long time. Long enough that the candle on the table had burned down a visible amount. Give me tonight, she said finally. Take all the time you need, he said. She gathered the documents carefully and held them against her chest and went to bed, and Wyatt sat at the table in the kitchen for a while longer and thought about Margaret Granger planting 40 trees and knowing her daughter well enough to try to protect her across the distance of death, and how even that had almost not been enough, and how it was still going to take everything Rosalie had to claim what had always been hers. She came to him in the morning with the documents in her hand and her mind made up. He could tell before she spoke. There was something different in the way she moved through the kitchen, a quality he hadn't seen in her before, or had seen only in glimpses on the ridge with the rifle over her shoulder and the bear somewhere below. A settledness, like a person who has put down something heavy and discovered their legs still work. I want to do it at the square, she said. The same place. He looked at her. All right. I want Judge Oates there, and I want Dale Cutter, because he's been in this valley longer than anyone, and people listen to him. She set the documents on the table with a deliberate flatness, the gesture of someone who has been carrying something carefully for hours and is now ready to set it where it belongs. And I want my father to come voluntarily, or I want him brought. But I want him there. I'll arrange it, Wyatt said. She looked at him. This is mine to do, she said. Not yours. I know. I need you to understand that. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to stand beside me while I fix it myself. He held her gaze. I understand the difference. She nodded once. Then she picked up the documents again and went to the bedroom to change, and Wyatt sat at the table and drank his coffee and thought that he had never in his life heard a sentence that clarified a situation as completely as the one she had just said. It took 2 days to arrange. Judge Oates was located without difficulty. He held office hours on Tuesday mornings, and Wyatt was there when the doors opened. The judge read both documents without comment, read them again, and then set them on his desk with the careful precision of a man who is managing his own reaction. These are legitimate, Oates said. I know. The property filing is 14 years old. The testament is 12. He looked up. Silas Granger has been managing this property under false pretense for over a decade. Yes. Oates was quiet for a moment. He was a practical man, not a dramatic one, and what he was doing was calculating the legal weight of the documents, the implications, the necessary steps. This will need to go through a formal process. The property transfer will have to be recorded. There may be questions about what was produced on that land in the intervening years. One thing at a time, Wyatt said. First, Rosalie Granger needs to stand in front of her community and have this read out loud. The legal process follows. Oates looked at him. She asked for that? Specifically. The judge nodded slowly. I'll be there. Dale Cutter, when Wyatt found him at the farrier's shop, listened to the whole story without interrupting. He had that quality some old men have when they've seen enough of the world that very little of it surprises them anymore. But he was still capable of being angered by it, and as Wyatt talked, he saw the anger move across the old man's face in a slow, controlled way. I knew Margaret Granger, Dale said when Wyatt finished. Good woman. Planted those first trees herself. I helped her carry the rootstock up from the wagon. He was quiet for a moment. I always thought it was strange, after she died, how Silas started talking about the orchard as his, how he'd built it up. He shook his head. Rosalie did the building. Anyone with eyes could see it. Will you come? I'll come, Dale said. And I'll bring Frank Hester and Tom Adler. Between the three of us, we've got 60 years in this valley. If we stand there, people will know it means something. Wyatt thanked him. Dale waved the thanks off. Don't thank me. I should have asked these questions 12 years ago. That's it. He told Rosalie what had been arranged. She listened with the documents in front of her, the same way she listened to everything, fully, without performing the attention. He doesn't know yet, she said. It wasn't a question. No. He's going to try to talk his way out of it. Probably. He's good at that. She looked at the document, at her name on it. He'll say my mother was confused, that the document doesn't mean what it says, that I misunderstood what he was doing all those years. She said it flatly, cataloging, not emotional about it. He has an answer for everything. He has an answer for everything when he has time to prepare, Wyatt said. He won't have time this time. She looked at him. You're going to tell him the morning of. The morning of, in person, in front of you. Something moved through her expression, not quite fear, but its neighbor. Then it settled. All right. There's something else, Wyatt said. When this is over, when the legal process runs its course and the property is formally in your name, you'll have decisions to make. What you do with it, whether you keep running it, whether you sell. He held her gaze. Those are your decisions. I want that to be clear. She looked at him with an expression he was becoming more familiar with. The one where she was checking whether the thing he'd said was real, whether there was a condition attached she hadn't found yet. You're not going to have opinions about it, she said. I'll have opinions when you ask for them. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what if I want to run it differently than I have been? Then you run it differently. What if I want to expand it, take on the eastern slope that my father's had fallow for 6 years because he doesn't know what to do with it? Then we talk about what that requires and figure out how to do it. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, in a voice that was quieter than her usual, my mother planted those first 40 trees in one season. She did it alone while my father was away working a cattle contract. By the time he came back, the trees were in the ground, and she'd filed the paperwork, and it was done. A pause. I think she always knew it had to be hers, that if she left it shared, it would become his. She was probably right, Wyatt said. She was right about most things. Rosalie looked at the window, at the morning outside. I used to be angry at her for dying, for leaving me there with him. She said it without drama, just honestly. I know that's not fair. It doesn't have to be fair to be real, Wyatt said. She looked at him. No, she said. It doesn't. The morning they chose was a Friday. Wyatt rode to the Granger property alone at 7, while Rosalie went ahead to the square with Judge Oates, who had agreed to be in position before anything else happened. Dale Cutter and his 2 companions were already in town. Silas was in the yard when Wyatt arrived, dealing with something at the water pump, and he looked up with an expression that shifted quickly through surprise and into wariness when he saw who it was. Mercer. Mr. Granger. Wyatt got off his horse. I need you to come to the square this morning. Silas studied him. The wariness became calculation. What for? There are documents from the county records office that need to be read publicly. Judge Oates is there. Rosalie is there. He held the man's gaze. You should come voluntarily. It'll be better for you if you do. Silas was still. There was a long pause. Wyatt watched him think. Could practically see the calculation running, the rapid assessment of what this could be about and how bad it was and what his options were. What documents? Silas said. Not a question. He already knew. Your wife's testament, Wyatt said, and the property filing she made 14 years ago. The silence that followed was different from the one before. This one had weight in it, the specific weight of something that has been kept under pressure for a long time when the pressure is finally released. Silas's face did something complicated. The performance dropped away. Not all of it. Some of it was built too deep to drop. But the outer layer came off, and what was briefly visible underneath was not the confident patriarch of Red Hollow, but something older and more uncertain, and not, Wyatt thought, entirely without shame. Not enough shame, but some. She had no right, Silas started. She had every right, Wyatt said evenly. It's legal. It's filed. It's been filed for 12 years. He kept his voice flat. Come to the square, Mr. Granger. Your daughter is waiting. Sight. The square was not as full as it had been the day of the bear announcement, but it was full enough. Word had moved through Red Hollow the way word always moved, imprecisely and quickly. And what people had heard was that there was something happening at the square involving the Grangers and legal papers and Judge Oates, which was enough to draw the curious and the invested and the ones who simply had nothing better to do on a Friday morning. Rosalie was standing near the mercantile steps, the same steps Silas had used for his announcement. She was in her work clothes again, the same dark dress, but she was standing differently than she had that day. Not arranged for presentation, just standing, straight and still, with the documents in her hands, waiting. Judge Oates stood beside her. Dale Cutter and Frank Hester and Tom Adler were off to one side, visible, present, not saying anything yet. Their presence said what they intended it to say. Silas arrived behind Wyatt and the crowd shifted to accommodate the new element, people turning, the ripple of awareness moving through the gathering. Silas had composed himself on the ride over. The performance was mostly back in place, the bearing, the authority, the unruffled quality of a man who believed he could handle whatever came. But there was something different in his eyes, and Wyatt could see it, and thought some others probably could too. Rosalie looked at her father when he came through the crowd. She looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, not with triumph, with something more complicated than either of those. The look of a person who has loved someone their whole life and has had to be honest with themselves about what that person is, and has found a way to hold both things without either canceling the other. Silas looked at her and then looked at the crowd and made a choice Wyatt had half expected, which was to try to take control of the situation before Oates spoke. "This is a family matter," Silas said to the crowd, with the voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "Whatever questions there are about our property can be sorted privately without—" "Mr. Granger," Judge Oates said, and his voice carried the particular authority of a man who has been a judge for 20 years and has learned that volume is less useful than clarity. "These documents are public record. They were filed publicly and they will be addressed publicly." He looked at Silas steadily. "You're welcome to say whatever you'd like to say after I've read them." Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't speak again. Oates read the property filing first. Margaret Granger's name. The orchard parcel. Sole registrant. The date. He read it slowly and clearly, and the square was quiet. Then he read the testament. He read it in full. Every word of it, in Margaret Granger's careful, plain language, leaving the orchard property in its entirety to Rosalie Margaret Granger, eldest daughter, to be held in her name, the signature, the notary mark, the filing date. When he finished, the square stayed quiet for a moment. Then the sound started, not a cheer, not exactly, but the sound of a crowd processing, murmuring, talking to each other, the collective noise of a community encountering information that rearranges something they thought they understood. Dale Cutter spoke then, which was what Wyatt had asked him to do if he felt it was right. Dale moved to stand near Oates and face the crowd with the ease of a man who had earned the right to be heard here. "I've been in this valley 63 years, Dale said. "I knew Margaret Granger. I watched her plant those first trees. And I've watched Rosalie Granger tend that orchard for 12 years. And every one of you who's bought those apples or used that fruit or knew that property, you knew who was doing the work." He paused. "I'm not here to tell you how to feel about it. I'm here to say that what those documents say is true, and I'll stand behind that." The murmuring shifted. A few people were looking at Silas with expressions that were no longer the social deference they usually carried. Silas tried once more. He stepped forward and turned to the crowd and said, "Margaret was confused about the property arrangements. She wasn't in her right mind at the end, and any document from that period—" "She filed that document 6 months before she died," Oates said, without heat. "She was well. I have records of other legal transactions she conducted in the same period, all fully coherent and properly executed." He looked at Silas with a measured steadiness. "You're welcome to contest the testament through proper legal channels, Mr. Granger, but I'd advise you to speak with a lawyer before you say anything further in public." Silas stopped, and in the stopping, in the particular quality of that silence, something broke. Not dramatically, not all at once, The authority he'd built in Red Hollow over decades didn't collapse in a single moment. It doesn't work that way. But something fundamental went out of it. The way a fire goes out, not in one dramatic extinction, but in a series of smaller failures, until there's nothing left that's giving heat. Rosalie had not spoken yet. She had stood through all of it, through Oates reading, through Dale speaking, through her father trying, with that same stillness, the documents at her side. Now she took a step forward. The crowd stilled again. Wyatt, standing off to one side, watched her. "I'm not going to speak about my father," she said, and her voice was clear and even and carried without effort. "What those documents say is the truth, and Judge Oates has read them, and I don't have anything to add to what they say." She paused. "What I want to say is something else." She looked out at the people in the square, people she had grown up among, people who had bought the fruit from the orchard and walked past her on the main street and sat near her family at public gatherings for 31 years. "This valley has known me a long time," she said, "and I know most of you have seen me the way my father taught you to see me, as someone secondary, someone who doesn't quite count." She wasn't accusing. Her voice was too controlled for that, too deliberate. "I'm not here to blame you for it. I did the same thing myself. For a long time, I believed it." The square was very quiet. "My mother left me something," she continued, "not just the land. She left the example of a woman who put things in writing, who knew that belief without documentation is just hope, and who tried to make sure her daughter had something real." She looked at the documents in her hands. "I didn't know about it. I found out because my husband went to the county seat and looked, because someone had told him the truth, that things left unexamined can be the most important things there are." She looked up. "The orchard is mine. I intend to run it, the same way I've been running it, except that now I'll know whose name is on the gate." She paused. "That's all I wanted to say." She stepped back. The silence held for another moment. Then Dale Cutter began to clap. A slow, deliberate sound, not performative, just real. And Frank Hester joined him, and Tom Adler, and then others in the crowd. Not everyone, not with the same fervor, but enough that the sound of it filled the square. Silas left before it stopped. He didn't go far. He was at the Granger house when Rosalie arrived there that afternoon, alone, without Wyatt. She had asked to do this part alone, and Wyatt had said all right, and she had ridden over after the square had cleared and people had drifted back to their days. She found her father in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table the way she'd seen him sit 1,000 times in her life, with coffee and a quality of presence that filled the room even when nothing was being said. He looked older, she thought. Or maybe she was just seeing him differently. She sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I'm not going to take the house," she said finally. "Whatever the legal process sorts out about the land itself, this house is yours. You can stay." She held his gaze. "I don't want you managing the orchard. I don't want you making decisions about it or telling people in town things about it, but I'm not putting you out of your house." Silas looked at her. Something moved across his face, something she couldn't quite name, and maybe it was gratitude, and maybe it was resentment of needing to feel gratitude, and maybe it was some compound of the two that had no clean name. "Rosalie," he started. "I'm not finished," she said. Not unkindly, just clearly. He stopped. "I know you probably have a version of this where you were taking care of things, managing the property so it wouldn't be lost, keeping the family going, doing what you thought was right." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to argue with that version. You might even believe it." She paused. "But I need you to know what those 12 years cost me. Not the labor. The other thing. What it cost me to believe I was worth nothing. To believe that every bit of good work I did was just discharge of a debt I owed." Her voice held. She'd had years of practice at holding it. "I need you to know that." Silas looked at the table. He didn't speak. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I'm not asking for an apology. I'm not sure it would help either of us." She stood. "Claire and Eliza are going to need to know about the orchard. Not the way you'd explain it, the way it is." She picked up her coat from the chair. "I'll talk to them." She walked to the door, then she stopped. "She was a good woman," Rosalie said. Mama, whatever you thought of how she handled things at the end, she was a good woman. She went out before he could respond, not because she was afraid of what he'd say, but because she'd said what she needed to, and there was nothing more that required adding. Clara took it harder than Rosalie had expected, which surprised her until she thought about it more carefully. Clara was not the villain of anything. She was 20 years old and had been raised in the same household, and had learned, as children learn, the structure of what mattered and who mattered, and had arranged herself accordingly. The new information required her to revise not just what she knew about her father, but what she knew about herself, what she'd been complicit in, even without knowing it was complicity. "I never asked," Clara said when Rosalie told her. They were in the yard, just the two of them. "I never asked what you did out there. I just ate the apples." "You were a child," Rosalie said. "I was old enough to notice." Clara looked at her with an expression that was young and honest and uncomfortable. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because I didn't know I could," Rosalie said, which was the truest answer she had. Clara was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Can I help?" "With the orchard." "I don't know anything about it, but I could learn." Rosalie looked at her youngest sister, 19 years old, genuinely trying, the offer real even if the capability wasn't there yet. "Maybe," she said. "Give me some time to sort out what the work looks like now." It wasn't a yes, and it wasn't a no. Clara accepted it, and Rosalie thought that was probably the most honest beginning they'd had. Eliza didn't seek her out, and Rosalie didn't seek out Eliza. And that was all right. Some distances don't close in a single season. The legal process took most of the autumn. Judge Oates oversaw the formal transfer of the property record. There were no legitimate grounds to contest the testament, and Silas, who had quietly spoken with a lawyer as Oates suggested, chose not to try. The orchard was formally registered in Rosalie Granger Mercer's name on an October morning, which was also the morning the first hard frost came, which was appropriate in the way that coincidences sometimes are, a cold, clean accounting of what was real. Wyatt was there. He stood beside her while Oates signed the transfer record and handed her the document. And her name was on it this time in the way that made it mean something. Not historical, not aspirational, but present and current and legal and real. She held the document and looked at it for a moment. He waited. "It doesn't feel as different as I thought it would," she said. "You've been running it the same way for 12 years, he said. "The feeling will catch up." She looked at him. "You think so?" "I think so," he said. "Give it until spring." She almost smiled. "You're guessing." "Some," he admitted. She folded the document carefully and put it in her coat. They worked the autumn harvest together. It was the first harvest where Rosalie didn't have to account for every decision to anyone, didn't have to manage the double labor of doing the work and then performing the work for Silas's benefit, didn't have to absorb the credit going somewhere else. It should have been easier than previous harvests. In some ways it wasn't. The first time you do something without the weight you've always carried, the absence of the weight is itself disorienting. And there were days where she caught herself bracing for a criticism that didn't come, a correction that wasn't made. Wyatt worked beside her and didn't try to direct what he didn't understand. When he knew something useful, he said so, and when he didn't, he asked, and the asking was direct and without performance. The way she'd come to understand he did most things. They had arguments. Not the devastating kind. The kind that working people have when they're tired and the fence needs mending and there's a disagreement about method. He thought she was managing the East Section's water retention wrong. She thought he was wrong about that. They argued about it with the honest irritability of people who aren't performing the argument and are actually trying to get at the right answer, and eventually they tried both approaches on alternating rows, and the evidence came in and she had been right, and he said so without making it smaller than it was. She found that she could tell him things. Not easily. It didn't come naturally, the telling, after so many years of containing, but she could do it. She told him about the 12 years. Not all at once, not in a confessional rush, but in pieces over the autumn, the way you tell someone things when you're working beside them, and the working makes the telling easier because you don't have to look at each other. She told him what it had been like to know the orchard down to its roots and be invisible inside it. She told him about the February conversation with Silas when she'd tried to describe the bear's pattern and he'd walked out of the kitchen. She told him, on a cold morning when they were pulling the last of the late variety, what it had felt like to stand in the square on the day of the announcement and understand that she had been offered and not intended simultaneously. He listened the way he'd always listened, without performing the listening, without rushing to respond, without filling the space with reassurance that would have made him feel better and her feel managed. He just let the things she said be what they were. Once, in November, he said, "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." She looked at him. They were in the barn, mending a crate. "You couldn't have been." "No, but I'm still sorry." She thought about that. "I'm not sure I was ready before now," she said. "To do any of this. To believe any of it." She worked a nail into the wood. "My mother tried to give me the tools, and I still almost couldn't use them." "You used them," he said. "Eventually." "That's usually how it goes," he said. "Eventually is how most things happen." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the ordinariness of the exchange, the barn smell, the work in their hands, his voice saying a true thing without dressing it up, that settled in her chest in a way that the square and the documents and the formal transfer had not quite managed. Those had been important. This was something else. This was just the daily texture of a life that was actually hers. "Wyatt," she said. "I'm glad you stayed." He looked at her. Something in his face that was the equivalent of the thing she'd just said, the same weight, differently expressed. "So am I," he said. By winter, Red Hollow had adjusted itself around the new reality the way communities do. Not gracefully, not completely, but functionally. The people who had laughed at the square mostly didn't bring it up. Mrs. Potts from the dry goods store was notably cooler than she'd once been, which Rosalie decided was acceptable. Dale Cutter came to the orchard in December with Frank Hester, and they spent an afternoon looking at the eastern slope that Rosalie had mentioned to Wyatt, the fallow land, the potential in it. And Dale, who had done some fruit growing himself in an earlier part of his life, had opinions about the soil that turned out to be useful. She started mapping it, not with the urgency of the Bear notebooks. This was different, slower, a kind of planning that was pleasure as much as work. She drew the slope at night sometimes, at the kitchen table, while Wyatt read or cleaned equipment or sat with his coffee. And the house had the specific quality of a house where two people have their own thoughts and don't need to fill the space between them. And that was its own kind of thing. She was learning to recognize as good. Clara came twice in December. The second time she actually worked, spent an afternoon with Rosalie in the orchard learning how to read the dormant trees for what they'd need in spring. She wasn't skilled yet, and she knew it, and the knowing it without performing either false modesty or false confidence was more than Rosalie had expected from her. "You're actually teaching me," Clara said at one point, with some surprise in her voice. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I didn't know," Clara said honestly. "I thought you might be... that there'd be..." She stopped. "There's no debt to clear between us," Rosalie said. "You didn't do anything wrong that you knew you were doing, neither did I, for most of it." She moved to the next tree. "Come look at this one. See how the bark looks at the base?" Clara came and looked and asked the right questions, and Rosalie taught her the way her mother had taught her. Not by explaining everything at once, but by showing the thing and letting the questions come naturally. And it was not perfect, and it was not simple, but it was a beginning. Sam, there is something that gets missed sometimes in the stories people tell about justice being done. The part that gets missed is how long it takes to believe it. The documents were signed, the property was transferred. The square had seen what it had seen. These were real things, real changes, with legal weight and community witness. But the thing that takes longer, the thing that can't be notarized or read aloud by a judge, is the interior shift. The moment when the evidence you've accumulated over months or years finally gets through to the part of you that was built before the evidence existed. When the long-taught knowledge of your own worthlessness starts to lose the argument it's been winning for decades. Rosalie didn't experience this as a single moment. She experienced it as a series of smaller ones, spread across a winter. The morning she walked the orchard without checking over her shoulder for Silas's reaction. The afternoon she made a decision about the eastern slope and didn't immediately compose a defense of the decision in case someone objected. The evening she sat at the kitchen table with her notebooks and looked at 12 years of careful work and felt, Not the complicated pride and grief she usually felt about it, but something simpler. Something like, I did this. It was good. It's mine. The night she told Wyatt something she'd been carrying for a month, small, personal, not dramatic, and he responded in the way he responded to things, which was directly and without making it larger or smaller than it was. And she realized she had told him without calculating whether it was safe to tell him. The calculation had just not happened. She had talked to him the way you talk to someone you trust, without first verifying that the trust is warranted because somewhere in the autumn and winter it had become something she simply knew. These moments don't arrive with ceremony. That's the thing about them. They come in the middle of ordinary days, over barn work and dinner and the kind of conversation that is not important in itself, but is the material of a life. And you don't always notice them when they come. You notice them later, when you look back and realize you are standing on different ground than you were, and the distance between that ground and where you started is something you couldn't have believed if you'd been told. Spring came early that year, and the trees came into bloom in the last week of March, which was ahead of the usual schedule. Rosalie was in the orchard the morning it really started. The morning when the blossom on the early variety came fully open, and the air in the orchard had that particular quality that only exists for a few days in a year, heavy and sweet and utterly temporary. She stood in the middle of the orchard her mother had planted, and she looked at the trees, all of them, 40 originals, and everything she'd added in 12 years, the eastern slope she was starting to prepare, the grafted trees along the east fence that had held through the winter, and she thought about her mother standing in this same place with saplings that came up to her waist. She thought about what it takes to plant something you won't see finished, to put roots in ground and know that what grows from them is not for you, but for whoever comes after. To write a document and file it and not tell anyone about it, trusting that eventually the right person would look. Her mother had known her well enough to do that, had known that Rosalie would need something legal and solid, not love, which she'd also had but which doesn't hold up in a court of record, but something with a signature and a filing date. Something that could still be true 20 years later when the world had changed and Rosalie had changed, and whatever the circumstances were, the document would still say what it said. She heard Wyatt's footsteps behind her and didn't turn. He came to stand beside her, and they looked at the orchard together for a while without speaking. The east section is going to be a good year, she said. Looks like it, he said. The eastern slope won't produce until the year after next at the earliest. Maybe the one after that. Depends on how the establishment goes. We've got time, he said. She looked at him then. He was looking at the trees, the morning light on the side of his face. The particular steadiness he had that she'd learned was not absence of feeling, but something more like a container for it. A person who felt things fully and had figured out how to hold them without either suppressing them or being governed by them. She thought about what a strange and unlikely thing it was, the path that had gotten them both here. A bear and a promise made in bad faith, and a man who asked a question nobody else had thought to ask, and notebooks filled in the dark, and a document her mother had signed 12 years ago. None of it was planned. Very little of it had been easy. And yet here they were, in the blossom-heavy air of a March morning, in an orchard that was hers, standing next to each other in the ordinary companionable way of people who have figured out how to be in the same life. She would have liked you, Rosalie said. He looked at her. My mother. She looked back at the trees. She didn't have much patience for people who performed, for people who made things sound better or easier than they were. She paused. She would have liked that you don't do that. I'll take that, he said quietly. They stood there a while longer. The blossom smell moved through the orchard on a slow current of air, and somewhere in the trees something small was moving. A bird, probably, working the branches for the early insects that come with the first warm days. Rosalie thought about a woman whose name was on a legal document in the county records, a woman who had planted 40 trees and understood what she was building and done it anyway. She thought about the kind of love that doesn't announce itself but shows up in the practical things, in filed paperwork and grafted rootstock, and a daughter taught to read the silence of trees. She had spent 12 years not knowing she had inherited that love, had spent them thinking she was alone in it, that whatever she built was built without any foundation beneath it. It turned out the foundation had been there all along. She'd just needed someone to go looking. "Come on," she said to Wyatt. "I want to show you something on the eastern slope." He followed her through the orchard, through the rows her mother had started and she had continued toward the land she was just beginning to make her own, and the morning opened ahead of them full of the particular stubborn, ordinary promise of things that are not finished but are fully, finally, undeniably in the right hands.